So we talked about cooking. We talked about cooking on Shabbat. One of the melachot is cooking on Shabbat. Okay, we defined that as chemical transformation of food through the application of heat in a way that makes it better. That's the actual cooking. So we also said, I believe, right, that things can only cook once. If they're dry, they only cook once. And so once something's cooked, you can't violate the prohibition against cooking it, even if you reheat it somehow on Shabbat. It's not true for liquids, because liquid in water doesn't actually, if you heat water, it's not being chemically transformed at all. It's really different, it's just getting hotter, which is not a chemical transformation. And so when it comes to liquids, you can violate the prohibition against cooking twice when it comes to liquids. So that's as pertains to the, there's a movie being shown outside. So, that's as pertains to the biblical prohibition. There are also, this should all be somewhat familiar, right? So this is hopefully, that's what I told you last time. There are also really more than two, but two very relevant rabbinic extensions of this prohibition that are really quite, that kind of further limit this concern. And the first is called, I don't think we talked to last time when we got there last time. The first, we did.
Shekia and Chazara.
We talking about both of them, or we?
It's on my notes, but it might just been the start. That's the last thing I have on here, so it's probably.
So let's talk about them and we'll see what they are. We'll define them, okay? And how you violate them and how you don't violate them.
I feel like I was writing notes and I didn't write down one too.
Hello.
When I met the work was very fast.
Welcome. Good time. Okay. That's my computer. You don't need to ignore it. But I'm going to take the coffee.
Yes, you can have two rabbinic and I was writing, so I skipped two extensions.
Okay, last time we talked about biblical cooking. This time we're talking about rabbinic prohibitions against cooking. So even when there's no possibility of violating a biblical prohibition, you still have to be concerned about these rabbinic prohibitions, namely shehiyah and chazar. Shehiyah is a prohibition against leaving something on the heat when Shabbat begins, lest you get tempted to adjust the flame, right? Imagine you're cooking over an old-fashioned wood-burning stove, and you have guests coming for Shabbos dinner, and your stew, your soup, your chicken, it's not going to be done in time, so you might take a poker and jostle the coals and make the fire burn a little bit brighter so that your chicken will roast in time, your bread will bake in time, your stew will finish in time. That would be a major violation of Shabbat. And so the rabbi said you can't have something on the fire directly when Shabbat starts, lest you stoke the coals. And that prohibition is called the prohibition against shehiyah. Shehiyah means leaving something on the fire. So shehiyah is what we don't do. There are, however, some exceptions. One exception, I feel like we may have talked about this, but even if we didn't, maybe we did now. I talked about this with somebody recently, it's okay. It's okay, don't worry, it doesn't matter, we'll do it again. It's worth...
We did talk about this somewhat.
Okay. So just maybe so can you tell me? What are some exceptions where it's not a problem, not prohibited shehiyah if you were to...
He says, I don't know how to say it, the piece of metal over the stove.
Yeah, so a blech,
yeah.
a piece of metal over the stove, over the flame, would overcome this rabbinic prohibition of shehiyah because it's a barrier between the food and the fire, between yourself and the fire. Really, it makes it harder, it's an obstacle to stoking the flames, and it makes it harder for you to stoke the flame. Some say really the blech should even cover the knobs on your oven. If you just modern stove with a knob, you just cover the knobs in addition to the blech, or maybe that's more important than the blech, so that you're not going to adjust the fire. That'll remind you that you're not going to stoke the fire, okay, or adjust it. Another way to avoid the prohibition of shehiyah is if
using something that doesn't look like you're cooking.
That's not going to help us for shehiyah. That's good. Hold on to that. That's a chazara concern. Shehiyah is going to also be overcome if what type of food does this prohibition? It's fully cooked. If it's fully cooked, then you're keeping it on the fire when Shabbat begins, because you want it to be warm when your guests come home from shul 30 minutes later, but you're not going to stoke the coals when it's already fully cooked. So you have fully cooked food that can stay on the fire when Shabbat starts. So you have your burners on, your oven stovetop is on, you have a big thing of soup when Shabbat starts, you can leave it on, that's fine. You can have the oven on, and if your chicken's roasting, as long as it's edible and like basically cooked when Shabbat starts, you can leave it in the oven's on as well as Shabbat starts. You can't turn the oven off, but it's okay to leave the chicken or whatever, the casserole, the cholent, in the oven on the flame when Shabbat starts, because you're not going to be tempted to adjust the flame because it's fully cooked. So either you cover the flame, or cover the knobs, or the food is fully cooked. There's another possibility which might also work. Not the food is fully cooked, but the food is
Raw. Fully
good.
Raw.
Yeah, excellent. Good. You remember that, or you guessed?
I remember.
Good. Okay, excellent.
Because like you obviously wouldn't eat it.
Exactly.
So like if you throw raw chicken in your
So why would you do that? What's it for? Why would you put raw
so
chicken?
that it's for tomorrow.
Exactly.
You
So
can
you
do it for like if it's for after Shabbat. You could.
yeah, right, exactly. So if right before Shabbat starts, you throw some raw meat into whatever it is, a big chunk of raw meat. No matter what you do, no matter how much you soak, it's not going to be ready in time for dinner. Clearly, demonstrably, this is for tomorrow's lunch, and so you also don't have to be concerned about covering the flame, covering your knobs, etc.
But you can't throw that raw thing like after Shabbat starts.
Because then that would be a violation of cooking, a biblical violation of cooking. Shia is a rabbinic prohibition, that's why it has some of these workarounds. But cooking is a biblical prohibition, there's no workarounds for that. But as long as you put it in before Shabbat, if it cooks on Shabbat, that's okay, right? We're allowed to, things that malacha, labor that takes place automatically without our intervention on Shabbat is fine, as long as we don't do anything on Shabbat, right? So you can...
So you can't like flip chicken over, for example. Like if you had it on a pan.
Right, exactly, right, because flipping it over would be facilitating the cooking. But an example would be, in the Mishnah talks about, you have fabric you want to dye, so you put it into a big vat with coloring, and you put it there on Friday, and you take it out Saturday night, that's okay. It's doing malacha all Shabbos long, but you're not doing anything, you just put it in and you left it. You have an olive press that you set up. You put the olives in, you put the stone on top, you put some weights on top, and it's going to press it very, very slowly. That's fine, and then the Beit Shammai is strict about this in the Mishnah, and it seems he's concerned maybe that not only should we rest, but our tools should rest as well. That he'll say, no, we don't have to be concerned about our tools resting, we have to rest, but anything we set in motion before Shabbat can happen on Shabbat. We don't have to worry about that, unless it's a problem of something that's making a lot of noise. If we make a lot of noise, then people will think that we're doing it on Shabbat, and that also contaminates the quiet, tranquil atmosphere of Shabbat, so you wouldn't want to throw your clothes in the laundry, in the washing machine, and press run right before Shabbat. Even though you're not washing, the machine's washing, the machine doesn't have to observe Shabbat, right? You just push the button before Shabbat starts, but Friday night you want to have the like that's not a Shabbos sound, okay? So we don't do things that are loud on Shabbat, even if we set it in motion before Shabbat. Dishwashers may be a gray area because they're kind of quiet. Question on what we've seen so far? Okay. That's one. Next is Chazara. Chazara is a prohibition against, Chazara is returning something to the heat once it was removed from the heat, which is only permissible under certain circumstances, like you take your soup off, you take your casserole off the burner to serve to people and you want to put it back on because maybe 20 minutes later they'll still be hungry and have seconds and you want it to still be warm, so you have to have in mind that you're going to return it, it has to still be hot, ideally you never fully set it down, and that way you can put it back on the heat after you brought it to the table to serve people. You can put it back on whatever it was on, let's say on the blech or whatever it was on. But Shabbos lunch, you can't take something out of the fridge and put it on a blech or put it in an oven because it's cold, right? Only Chazara is permissible, only returning things to the heat that retain their heat, that never cool down is permissible on Shabbos. You can never take something cold, even if it's fully cooked, and put it on a heating element because that looks like cooking. And therefore, I think one of you said something right about if it doesn't look like cooking, then it's okay. So if you instead of putting it on the blech, putting it in the oven, instead you put it on a warming tray, then it doesn't look, the warming tray can't be used for cooking because it's just not a tool for that. It has no knob, you can't adjust, it doesn't really get hot enough to cook. It'll break if you try cooking on it, it's not meant for that. So a warming tray can be used, even if it's something cold from the refrigerator, can you put out a warming tray on, and 45 minutes later, it'll be a nice warm thing for Shabbos lunch or Saturday afternoon, Shabbos Shabbos time dinner, Saturday afternoon, for a long Shabbos afternoon, you can do that as well. Also, warming drawer. Have you ever seen one of those? That's like a very fancy accessory and certain. Does your sister have a warming drawer in her?
Turn it on, hold it out,
Yeah.
put it in.
Hi guys.
Hi.
Hello, hello, hello. Come in. Welcome. Please have seats. I'll give a.
So warming drawers are allowed, you just can't turn them on and off. But if you leave it on, my family at home, we always forget to turn off the warming drawer. So then
You
it's
have warming drawers in your head?
like
I
a
thought only-
one, no, they're like, I don't know, it's like part of, we have just like a double oven and a microwave, but it's like from like when we moved into our house probably like
I thought it was like
10
only
years
like
ago.
answer. I thought she was about warming drawers.
No, well I think also, maybe it's a British thing that they used to like also.
Maybe. I mean, if you're hosting
But
us,
like,
but
I think, I don't know, I think it came with our house, and we bought it like a long time ago, so, but we forget to put
The
it,
question is, the person who owned it, where they do it.
maybe, but but we always forget to take stuff out, and in the morning, like, oh man, I forgot stuff in, like, so, but that's fine if you leave.
It's not. You can't use for cooking. It's not used for cooking. It doesn't look like something you cook in.
That's fine.
It's not like it's not a setting on your oven. It's like a special appliance. That's different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Hi guys. I don't think we've met before.
We
You've met before.
last time, yes.
That's right. I'm sorry. We did. Remind me. your name?
Natalia.
Natalia. And you are
Nissim.
Nisin. Have we met before?
No.
No. You came by yourself last time.
Yes.
Great. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. So we. Okay, so we're discussing more about the laws of cooking or not cooking on Shabbat and warming on Shabbat and how we don't cook, and we talked about avoiding cooking on Shabbat, and now the two rabbinic prohibitions, shehiyah, things that remain on the heat as Shabbat begins, and chazara, we can only put things back on to a warm place if they never cooled down, but we can't take things out of the fridge if they're cold and heat them on Shabbat unless it's on a warming tray or a warming drawer. Or, what else? Any other? This is less common.
Like on top of the water boiling.
Good, very good. Yeah, if it's on top of something that is itself a cooking pot or something. So if you have a hot water urn that's made of metal and gets kind of hot, you can put something on top of it. Because that's not how you cook. That doesn't look like cooking. So you can put things on top of the hot water urn, and they actually make, cousins in Jerusalem have, it's like a giant metal hot water urn that goes on the stove. And you turn on the burner, there's like a flame underneath it, it's like a big thing of water, and it's made of metal, it has a entirely flat top, and you can put all sorts of things on top of it, and then you can take it out of the fridge and put it on top, and that's not chazara because it doesn't look like cooking, and as long as it's solid and fully cooked, you can warm something cold on Shabbat day, and that's how you have your Shabbos lunch. They also make, if you have a crock pot and you're making a cholent, sometimes you can fit things on top, like when you warm up some challah, or I don't know, whatever
So
it might
even
be.
on the stove, even though your intent is to turn on the stove to heat this thing, to take...
So you turn on the stove you turn on before Shabbat. It heats. Yeah.
You turn it down,
Low. It's on a low flame all of Shabbat.
and then you can turn that up.
You can't turn. You can't not just on Shabbat. You cannot adjust that at all. You just leave it. You have this big thing of water which is boiling away, and all Shabbat long you have hot water for tea or whatever you want, and it's all great. Yeah. Yes.
Last time you mentioned that those rules don't apply to if you're heating with a hot plate, correct?
A warming tray. Warming trays are fine because they're not used for cooking. They have no knobs for adjustment. They're not used for cooking. You can't really use them for cooking. That's not what they're meant for. That's not what they look like. Exactly. Warming trays are great. Warming trays are. I recommend warming trays. Those are good because then you can take it out of the fridge and heat it. You can put them on a timer, so you get like an appliance timer for them, and then they go off at night, and it's a little safer than leaving a flame burning all night. And so warming trays are good. I mentioned tea.
Yeah.
We were talking about tea. We talking about tea last time?
Yeah.
A little bit, you
You
mentioned,
said
yeah.
like the secondary vessels. and-
Good. Okay, so we're not gonna talk about it again. We'll talk about tea. Okay, good. All these things are in books. You can read about them. You can if you have follow questions, you can ask me follow questions. But we talked about it already. We're gonna move on. Okay. Let's go on to in Roman numeral 2. Letter number 6. In addition to the, sorry, you want to, sorry. Thank you. You're welcome, very welcome. And Shabbat is described in the later on, like after the Torah and later biblical writings in the prophets. There are sort of added elements that are emphasized, and these are what are called what Scripture says in davar, not to speak about or pursue our own needs. And talk about regular things on Shabbat, and that's sort of significant and worth emphasizing, because not only do we have these 39 categories of labor, of which we've discussed many of them, I think most of the very particularly relevant ones. Also, there's a spirit of Shabbat that has to be protected, and the laws themselves, ironically, there's so many laws, so many things are outright forbidden, but that's just to, I think I've said this before, I know I've said this before, that's like carve out a space, carve out some time for us to do something really positive and holy and sacred, and that means that those restrictions, those basic laws are not going to be enough. So it's not enough to avoid cooking and avoid sorting and avoid grinding and avoid kneading and sorting and writing and tying complicated artisanal knots and all the... Also, we're supposed to speak differently. We're not supposed to speak about business matters. We're not supposed to speak about
sports.
Look, sports. Let's put that aside for now. Because that's a gray area. I mean, I think the problematic speech would be talking about business and about.
They said I was reading a book that was saying about things to do with your weekdays, basically, like anything that you have to do, or things that were more so than.
Right. So it's about so if it's about how much am I going to spend for, I'm going to like actual dollars and cents, just conversations about sums and figures and money, that would be a problem. If it's about weekday, I have this thing coming up in work this week, and my supervisor is going to say this, and I'm going to say that to him, and but so and so, Stacy's going to have my back when I say this, whatever. That's also would be work day, talking about work matters. That would be problematic. That's on the bad list. On the good list would be talking about the Torah portion, and talking about your relationship with God, and talking about the needs of the community and your family, and how was your week, and how are you feeling, and with your friends and family. That would be the good list. In between would be things that are talking about sports, which I'd say if it's a way to connect to other people, and if that's I think that's a really powerful way that people bond to one another, which is good, right? That forms within a family, talking about the playoffs, that's great, unless it kind of draws their attention away from Shabbos, and it's you don't want to be sitting around on Shabbat. I wish I could turn on the radio and hear the baseball scores. I wish I weren't here, but I was watching the game happening right now. That's not good. If it's friends and family gathering around to talk about things they love and have share in common, I think that would be okay. There may be some other things in gray area. I think I started my career as a rabbi working on a college campus, and the students would ask us about studying on Shabbat, reading material, their coursework on Shabbat, and I said it depends on how if it's I'm reading this only for my class, I'm reading this because I have an exam tomorrow, that would be not really appropriate for Shabbat, because it's not about the day, it's just doing something now, preparing for some task I have to do during the week. That would be inappropriate. But if this is a great book that I love and find meaningful, then I think that would be okay. And I think sometimes coursework and studying can be somewhere in between. It really depends on the subject matter and how the individual student feels about that subject matter, whether or not it's Shabbat appropriate to talk about it or engage in it. There's a joke about the violation of this concept by a man in shul goes up to someone and he says Nish Shabbos Geret, which is Yiddish for we don't talk about this on Shabbos, which is what you say before you're about to say something that you shouldn't talk about on Shabbos. So he says Nish Shabbos Geret, I'm selling my car, and the other guy, this was Friday night. So Shabbos morning, the other fellow comes up to him and says, Nish Shabbos Garet, how much are you asking for it? So I said, Nish Shabbos Garet, $10,000. So during Kiddush, he says, Nish Shabbos Garet, it's not worth more than 6. And he says, Nish Shabbos Garet, what about 8? And when Shabbos ends, he says, okay, fine, 8, I'll buy the car. And he says, sorry, I sold it at Mincha. So don't be like that, okay? That's not, it's a joke, but don't be like that. It's not what we do on Shabbat. It's not about, and I think that's something that I'd say, it's, that's a way, this whole sphere is, actually, the Shabbat in general is a way to really, it's an area of Jewish life that you can really invest in. And there's a lot of people who keep Shabbat in a casual way, which is great. They don't work on Shabbat, they come to shul on Shabbat, they don't drive, they don't watch TV, that's all wonderful. But with more study and more care, and just being conscientious, you learn about the real careful details about avoiding sorting and selecting and cooking and heating and do everything correct, and that's a lifetime of perfection and learning how to do that well. And also you can then invest in making Shabbat a really spiritual, tranquil, beautiful day for yourself and for your family and for your community. And the conversations that take place around the Shabbos table, I think, can really, it's just different. The people who, let's say you have a group of friends or a family where no one's working, no one's driving, that's wonderful, that's great, but if they're talking about work and they're fighting with each other and they're, whatever, it still might be lacking something of that really special nature of the day, and I think families can decide, or groups of friends can decide to really let's invest our Shabbos table or our Shabbos conversation. Let's really try to make it really something special, and that's whether we'll instead of just sitting around the table and talking, let's be conscientious. Let's think through what do we want to. Let's have a conversation starter. It doesn't have to be many families that someone gives a Dvar Torah. I'm not so into the ironically, I feel they're a little bit. I don't want to sit at the table and hear somebody give a speech. That's not interesting to me personally. So I know some people really love it, but I do like it when the conversation does something meaningful. It could be not a Dvar Torah, but not like a speech, but a question that's from the at least Torah portion, or some question about some weighty matter of spiritual concern. Let's have a conversation about significant things when we're together on Shabbat, because no one's rushing to watch a TV show and no one has to get back to work and no one has any place to be, just with each other, and let's have a great conversation and not talk about business, not talk about work, and just talk about things of ultimate value. So I'm saying this to you. You think I'm saying this to you. Really, I'm saying this to myself, and you all are invited to, and you're here listening in as I talk to myself and kind of psych myself up for this kind of investment, because it's not easy, and especially when you have a lot of guests or you have kids, it's just the conversation can shift to business or can shift to just, it's mundane things, but I think with some investment and some planning, it's really possible to use the time for people to learn about each other in a deep way. And there was a Shabbos meal before we had kids, so it was very leisurely, conversation around the table. I just remember, everyone at the table. It was a small. Because when we first married, we only had 6 chairs. We only owned 6 chairs. So there, my wife and I, and then up to 4 guests. That was our limit. That was all we could do. So I remember one meal where there were it was maybe 2 or 3 guests and us, and just everyone was talking about their religious journeys that had brought them from, their childhood to where they were now, and their relationship to Torah and their relationship to mitzvah. And it was people were really sharing. It was really trustful, safe way. People felt they could kind of open up about issues of faith, which is not so easy to talk about necessarily. And you're not close friends, but the environment was such that people really felt opening up. And I just remember each person told their story, and one person shared, and then the other person shared and says as well, we're the interesting ones, but you guys, you must have a boring story. And they said, well, actually no, because here's my story. And the next person told her story about sort of religious growth and transformation from her childhood to adulthood, and then they turned to the last, but well, you though, you're I guess the only one here who has no story. It's no, actually not quite so true. And it was it's a beautiful, I remember it very, very clearly. It's a beautiful, beautiful a meal that just, again, if you're not talking about the things that we often talk about during the week, but open yourself for talking about really different things, then it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that Shabbat can give to you, and so it's a gift to all of us. Okay, so that's item number 6. Don't talk about money. Don't talk about business. You are allowed to talk about finances if it concerns issues of the community. You can talk about issues of tzedakah, issues of money that's needed for the poor or for communal issues. So if there's, I don't know, God forbid, some emergency, there's a hurricane, and there's a community that needs urgent assistance, you can, gather around and say, okay, how are we going to get, how are we going to raise $50,000 to help this community evacuated for the hurricane? And I can give $5,000. It's a very, very tachlis, very practical nuts and bolts conversation, because it's not about our own material gain, it's about a tzedakah purpose. And so those types of conversations can take place on Shabbat.
Probably pledging is okay.
That's probably why pledging is okay. It's not, yeah, basically, yes. Yes. Pledging falls under that, yeah. Okay, number 7. The melachot, the 39 categories of labor, are not necessarily things that are toilsome. They are things that are creative. They transform the world. They transform objects. We went through many of them, not all of them. You should go through all of them. They're all considered crafts. They're things that you have to do with intention and focus, and they transform objects. They transform the world in productive ways. That's, I think, overall true for all 39 melachot. They're not necessarily hard to do in the sense of physical exertion. It's not hard to write. It's not hard to strike a match. Okay, it's not hard to fry an egg. None of these things are physically toilsome. They all are transforming the world in a way that we refrain from on Shabbat. Physical toil, it's called tircha in Hebrew, is also forbidden rabbinically, not necessarily, or, well, let's say, it's forbidden outside the category of the 39 melachot. It's not one of separate from these 39 categories of labor. We don't do things on Shabbat that physically strain us. Again, you could, what's the melacha? There's no category of labor that I could take heavy boxes from my attic to my basement, to my attic all day long. That's not violating any one of the melachot, but that would be if I'm all sweaty and tired and I'm schlepping, that's not what Shabbat is supposed to be about. Separate from the 39 categories of labor. That's an additional category that they should be restful and tranquil. We avoid things that strain us. Kids can run and play, and I think adults can maybe do some amount of, some degree of running if it's enjoyable for them, like if they're just have a playful spirit, they could, run and jump and skip, whatever. But we're not supposed to get sweaty, not supposed to get that kind of physical exertion is not done on Shabbat. The Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, a very important medieval scholar, who wrote a commentary on the Talmud. He wrote a commentary on the Torah as well. He wrote a bunch of really important essays. He writes that the Torah describes Shabbat as a Shabbaton, a restful day, and he says that's a biblical obligation, that Shabbat should be a restful, tranquil day. And he says this is separate and beyond all the 39 categories of labor, because the 39 categories of labor, as we've been alluding, as we've been saying, they're not enough, they're not sufficient. You can schlep boxes up and down all day long. You can actually open your store. There's no biblical prohibition against opening your store and buying and selling things. There's no biblical violations in it. Those are rabbinic prohibitions only. And there are these rabbinic restrictions. Okay, fine, but why are they? Because there's a biblical obligation that the day should be restful and tranquil, and therefore we don't do things that are not in the spirit of Shabbat. So the 39 categories of labor and their details inform us about the spirit of Shabbat, and then we have an obligation to not go to a baseball game even if you have free tickets, not to go to work even if it doesn't involve any malacha. So you're going to go to work and you won't write. You'll just go to work and you'll sit on a meeting with your team. Okay? You won't write, you'll walk to the office and you won't write anything down. You just go to be at work and you won't write. No, that's not restful, that's not tranquil, that's a violation of the spirit of Shabbaton, even if it doesn't violate one of the 39 melachot. Yeah, you were going to say something?
I had a question, kind of a tangent, but I think I was reading the prohibition against currency on Shabbat. I thought you just actually couldn't handle money, but I think I was reading that it's really more that you might lead to writing down a ledger. Is that
Yeah, so the prohibition against buying and selling, I think, is indeed, or handling money is related to the prohibition against writing something down. If you buy and sell, you might record something. But I think it also is an expression of this idea as well, that it's sort of workaday activities, the world of commerce is rabbinically prohibited. Also, that the day should be tranquil and restful, and not to be pursuing our own ends as well. So there might be some difference where, like, maybe using a credit card would not violate, it's not currency per se, but you're not going to write anything down because you get the credit card bill anyway at the end of the month, so you don't need to write anything down, but it still would be a violation of this, like, spirit of Shabbat kind of thing. And I think the spirit, that's becoming increasingly important because we don't do, even during the week, we no longer do melacha as often as we once did. Like, when was the last time you plowed? Right? I would wager many weeks since you plowed, right? When was the last time you ground, for your own flour? Okay, probably a very long time, right? So even during the week, we're no longer farmers. We don't live in an agrarian setting. We don't do most of the 39 melachot, like, ever. And when Jews stopped being farmers and moved to mostly living in cities, the rabbis were confronted with, actually our 39 melachot aren't quite sufficient to make Shabbat really different and special. And so some of these restrictions of muktzah, restrictions against commerce, were added rabbinically so that Shabbat would be more different. Even more so that's necessary now, because most of what we do is like sitting in front of a computer, and we're not even writing. We're not even writing, we're just, moving atoms around, moving electrons around with a computer. It's not clear there's any malacha involved in that, not any pure malacha implicated in that, but not using electricity, not using electronic devices and our phones and our computers and our TVs, like, that's the most important thing probably for most of us to make Shabbat different and special. So I think this point is really, really important, that it's, aside from the melachot, you always have to ask, is this fitting, is this in keeping with the spirit of Shabbat? So I think that's why you use phones and TVs and radio. It's there might be some melachot in as well. There might be some technical prohibitions implicated in them, depending on what you're using them for and how they're used and what your theory is on how they work and all that. But even before you can get there, it's just Shabbat is supposed to be a day that's different and special and sacred. And the easiest way we can do that is by putting aside our phones and our computers, and that's probably more than almost anything else. So I think this idea has to be, I think, is one of the most important ideas, for like Shabbat in the 21st century is keeping it different. And as technology develops, it could be that we can be more lenient about certain types of, there's some contemporary rabbis who are more lenient than many rabbis were a generation ago. We understand how electricity works. We can make distinctions. They know you can't use your phone, but maybe it's okay to use a key fob, right? Like, that would be an interesting distinction. There's no malacha in using a key fob, and getting access to your condo or your hotel room, whatever, could be in the spirit of Shabbat, in a way that using a phone is not. And I think if we can manage that distinction of being maybe more lenient over time with some of these electricity questions as our homes become more electronic and life becomes more, interconnected and wired, while also maintaining that strictness against, phones and computers, I think we'll be okay if we can manage that. There was someone who tried to develop something called like the Shabbos phone. It was like a, remember that? Do you remember this?
Yeah, I saw that one.
I think it was a terrible idea, but it was like a module. You could like switch your smartphone to being like entirely fine for Shabbat. I forget how. It was some like thing in the computer program where it would switch to everything. Would be grumma. It would be indirect causation only through the computer circuitry. And it's like added layer of delay in the software, and then you could text your friend and say, like all these great things. Oh yeah, I'm late for Shabbos lunch, but start without me, or I don't know, whatever. How great that would be. But like, no, actually, I think it would destroy Shabbat if you could have that. That it would take away the spontaneity. It would take away like sometimes it's a little bit. I guess now we're used to like always being able to track people down and communicate them, so you kind of expect that. It can be a little frustrating when you can't do that. If like, I thought you were going to show up here at 4 o'clock, so we could walk together to shul in the afternoon. You're not here. What happened? And okay, but like. We've survived for a long time that way, and just being cut off, being like removed from like the outside world, so we can focus on like the inner world. The inner world inside ourselves and the inner world, just within our communities and our families, I think it's invaluable. So okay. Any questions or comments on that? Anything? Okay. The last of the melachot is the prohibition against moving something from one domain to the next. This is a strange melacha because it doesn't change the object itself. Most of the other melachot I just said change something. Moving something from place to place doesn't really change it per se, or at all, so it's sort of interesting that it's a melacha, but it is one anyway. It definitely is. You're not allowed to carry on Shabbat. You're not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain, or from a public domain to a private domain, or 4 cubits, which is about 6 feet, within a public domain. Carrying means lifting, moving your 4 cubits, and then putting it down. That's an act of carrying. That's what we don't do on Shabbat. Again, from inside to outside, from outside to inside, or more than 4 cubits outside. So how do you survive that way? You're allowed to wear things. Clothing is permitted. Things that are accessories or jewelry is permitted, but carrying is not. So you can wear a wristwatch, you can wear glasses, you can wear a necklace, but you can't carry keys in your pocket. You can't wear keys around your neck on a chain, because that's carrying. Okay, that's the distinction. You can't push a stroller, you can't carry a newspaper or a book or talit. Okay, from private to public, from public to private, or in the public domain. Yes?
What about a baby?
Cannot carry a baby. We lived for 5 years in a place where, you can't carry a baby either. You can carry a baby inside the house, you can't carry a baby outside the house, or from the outside inside, or more than 4 cubits outside. If you have a toddler who can walk on his own, and he has like a meltdown, you can probably lift up the toddler, because he can carry, once he's old enough to walk on his own, if he doesn't, you can get him up and, to move along.
What about like babies and like how do all these people come to services?
Okay, so
is that because of the
yes.
area? Okay.
So I will get there. So because we go
But if you were in an area that's not,
if you're in an area that has no eruv,
yeah,
the baby stays inside all day, which is why people tend not to live in places like that with children. We did it for 5 years. We had 4 children, who we raised in a community without an eruv at the time. And one of us was home with the young children all day long. When they got older, we could take them out for short walks, but it was challenging. It was a challenging way to live. I think if you're used to it, then that's part of your rhythm, as somebody stays home with the kids, and you take turns going outside and staying home, and people visit one another, and to relieve loneliness, and that's how the day goes. There's also a fix to this prohibition called an eruv, which cannot override the biblical prohibition, but it can override a rabbinic prohibition. Biblically, as I said, you can't compare private to public, from public to private, or more than 6 feet in a public domain. The biblical definition of a public domain is like a giant plaza, like a central area. If you can imagine like an old Roman city which had a main street that went clear across the city from one end to the other, and tens of thousands of people would gather in this giant city, could go out in this giant city. That's a real public domain, and generally the way cities are laid out and the way the halachic definition of public domain has developed over the centuries, we no longer have public domains in almost all of our urban areas. And so what we have, it's called a carmelite. It's an in-between area. And rabbinically, you can't carry in a carmelite, you can't carry from a carmelite to a private, from a private to a carmelite. So the laws are the same, but instead of being a biblical prohibition, it's just a rabbinic prohibition. And because it's a rabbinic prohibition, we're able to override it through the construction of something called an eruv, which I will explain, and that will be the end of today's class. Okay? An eruv works as follows. Let's say we have 2 apartments that share a courtyard in between, like your sister's, okay, two homes, 2 private domains, but there's a common area in between. So they couldn't really carry from their home to that yard in between because the yard is not, it's like a different domain, okay? So what you could do, they take some food in common, like a box of matzah or whatever it is, and say this food belongs to both of us. We're sharing our food. We'll keep it on the shelf here, and you can come into my house to take this food, and therefore I can go to your house. It's a way to join these two properties together and the courtyard that they have in between, and we are going to then sort of merge these domains. So that's 2 apartments with a courtyard. Imagine now, that could also work for 5 or 6 apartments, little homes, all opening up onto a common alleyway. This is discussed in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and this was done very commonly. A bunch of Jews, all living in a little area, all observing Shabbat together. They would take food that they owned in common, declare it to belong to all of them, and then in that way they would merge all of their domains and those common areas in between. They could then carry back and forth in between. What a modern Eruv does is takes that concept and applies it to a neighborhood. So instead of several homes sharing a courtyard, it's like an entire neighborhood that has a boundary, a halachic boundary around the entire neighborhood. Either a walled city, or something similar to a walled city. We have a walled city here. The eastern wall is the seawall along Lake Michigan. The western wall is the fencing along the metro tracks on Ravenswood. And the northern and southern wall are composed of wires that make a series of archways that are strung across the utility poles on Irving Park and Fullerton. It's a wall that's comprised entirely of open space, but it's a wall. What's a wall? It's a door. Walls have doors, have gateways. A gateway is 2 vertical parts with a horizontal part across the top. So we have utility poles with wires across the top, and that's our wall. And so we have an entire area surrounded by a wall. It's true not everyone who lives here is a Sabbath observant Jew who is contributing and wants to participate in this Eruv. Instead, we have a resolution from City Council granting us the right to carry in this area, which takes the place of getting permission from every single person who lives within our enclosure. So in such a community, there are 250 of them now in North America, one is allowed to carry on Shabbat. But it has to be maintained. There's a box of matzah in my office. That's the Eruv. That's the food that's owned in common. Anyone can eat it. It belongs to all of you. Just don't eat all of it. And there is there's a boundary. The boundary is checked every week because it's constantly subject to disruption because of construction or accidents or things that happen.
So if there's like a storm and it
gets knocked down, then
until it's fixed.
Can't carry it on Shabbat.
Did something happen with it last year? I thought I remember seeing something about like
there have been a couple of weeks
where something we're trying to fix it.
Yes, in fact, last week actually that happened. Last week we were confident we'd get it up in time, so it wasn't like a lot of anxiety. But there have been weeks where we weren't certain we could get it fixed in time, and we've sent out an email saying it might be down. Wait to hear from us if it's going to be up. And my first year working here, which was already 6 years ago, in that winter, so not quite 6 years ago, the winter when I first arrived here, there was like maybe 1 or 2 weeks where the Eruv was down because a snowplow knocked over one of our poles, and it was to go some time until we could get it fixed. And the Eruv was down, and so people shouldn't carry. People didn't carry that Shabbat. You can buy. And there are people who live outside the Eruv who never, even who come here regularly, just live north of Irving Park and outside the Eruv, like the little west of Ravenswood. You can buy belts that where the key is incorporated into the business end of the belt, like I don't know what you call it, this part, the tine, I think, is that, I don't know, the thing of the buckle. So this comes off, and you put your key here instead. So the key is an integral part of the is an integral part of the belt. It's keeping your pants up. It's like keeping your belt on. It's part of your clothing. You're wearing it. You're not carrying it. It's functional. There's another. You can also make somewhere that you can send them a belt, and they cut out a section in the back, and you can hook in a little chain, and your key is then keeping the belt on. That looks a little nicer because it looks like you have everything looks nice in front, and in the back there's a little gap there, and the key is actually integral to keeping the belt on.
So you can do that with like a necklace too, right?
You can do it with a necklace if the key is actually keeping the necklace clasped. If it's just hanging from the necklace, that's not ornamental. It's not a piece of jewelry. That's a key. You're not fooling anyone. But if it's actually keeping the key, the necklace on, it's like a link in the chain. The necklace would fall off without it, then that's fine. You can also there's also a way to tie your shoes. When you tie a bow. First you tie one knot, then you make your loops, so if you skip that first knot, and instead you thread the shoelaces through the eye of the key, and then you do the loops and you tie it off, then the key is actually performing a function in your shoes, keeping your shoes on, keeping the lace, right? It's actually a functional part of the knot, and that is also fine, right? That's a neat trick as well, if you have shoes with laces. So there are ways to live in on Shabbat without an Eruv. It's particularly challenging for parents of young children, which is, again, why over the last, 30 years, 40 years, there have been like 200 Eruvs that have been built in North America, because parents of young children want to live in places where they can leave their house on Shabbat, which was maybe not a concern a generation or two ago, and so those are the communities that are seeing growth, and that's where people move to, and other communities that don't have it, they get one, or people don't really stay, and those communities get much smaller over time. Yeah?
How does the, north and south parts connect to the seawall? Does it need to?
It does. It has to get with yes. So if you go to, you can see this. If you go to...
I tried to look. I must have looked in the wrong place.
Okay, we should do it in the spring. We should do like another Eruv field trip or a bike. My first spring here, we had a bike the Eruv event on a Sunday morning. It was really fun. So if you go to Irving Park, you see where the Eruv crosses Lakeshore Drive.
Yeah.
It goes to a pole and to another pole, and then it goes to the fence around the golf course.
Mm-hmm.
So that fence then becomes our Eruv boundary. That fence goes north up to Montrose.
Okay.
All the way around Montrose Harbor, and you can go up to Montrose Harbor. You'll go in and you park there. You see where the golf course goes, but where the golf course gets really close to the seawall, and we have a pole there right by the seawall, and there's a wire across and goes right by the seawall. And something very similar at Diversity Harbor. Yeah. And Ravenswood, it's tied off to the venture tracks. So it goes really close. So all those gaps are filled in. You can have small gaps up to 10 cubits. Up to 10 cubits.
That's long enough.
Yeah, because it's like a wall. As long as most of it is wall, you can have gateways in your wall, as long as none of them are more than, let's say, 15 feet in width. Any questions about this? Okay. Let's pause now. The next two classes, I think, are already on the calendar, in the bulletin, on the schedule, so I don't know. So we'll meet then. And thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.